Yeah, my presentation, thank you obviously to the organizer to invite me. I love very much Torun and this university. And it's a good opportunity to dig deeper into these hard questions that we are posing today. So theology has tried to offer an inspiring explanation on the causes and motives involved in pain and suffering along history and personal experience. This is a service that was usually delivered by so-called salvation religions. It is clearly the case of Buddhism as well, a religion of salvation that aims at exploring their causes and at reducing suffering. Even if religion was not alone in this task of tackling suffering, in more recent times evolutionary biology and other scientific approaches offer interesting explanations and open the field to a new understanding and interventions. When such studies acquire a certain maturity, the question arises spontaneously. Do we still need the old religious or theological approach? Indeed, the new scientific explanations render somewhat redundant the traditional theological views, which add very little to the real causes and motives around that seemingly negative feature that share more sentient animals. The former issue is quite serious. We could nevertheless retort saying that religions are not rendered redundant or superfluous by the explanation science offers, as they still play an important function, that is, coping with distress and sufferance. However, other opinions could say that once we better know the causes, mechanisms, and factors involved in that apparently negative experience, we can address them in a better way than religions those. Take, for instance, the huge development of painkillers, the expansion of palliative counseling and care, and other therapeutic interventions that simply ignore religion but show some efficiency. The question still looms: do religions still provide a useful approach to deal with suffering, when in many cases their function and performance can be replaced by better secular means? Is religion still a stakeholder when we deal with pain and suffering? Is the word they use now more, as being a stakeholder in this kind of business. The questions just raised can be distinguished at two different levels: at the level of study and the provision of better ways to understand pain and suffering, and the practical level of the one paying more attention to means to address that problem. So less about explaining and more about addressing or tackling the problem. Possibly both aspects are quite linked, as a good explanation is the first step towards projecting meaning and hence to coping with such issues. A different way to look at this is just pragmatic. It is rather the capacity to cope and to gain resilience despite great pain and suffering what renders the interpretation of that experience more plausible and significant, and perhaps Christian theology can play there a better role. For many people, indeed, what renders credible a proposal is just its utility or how helpful it is perceived. My presentation tries to explore, so this the outlook, this complex panorama. In this sense, a first aim is to better assess to what extent the evolutionist and, by extension, the scientific theories explaining pain and suffering can be received as a challenge or as an opportunity for a theology that does not fear to engage with science. Second, the described panorama should help us to better state what is the specific and interesting contribution of theology in this new context and regarding those negative experiences. And third, we need to connect theological reflection with the abundant literature on religious coping and resilience to make sense of the theological proposal, perhaps from an indirect or from the door behind. Indeed, possibly a sort of reverse engineering could help to regain the meaning of theology that nourishes and enforces such coping capacity, which is still perceived as necessary despite all the progress in pain killing and other usual therapeutic remedies. So let's go with the first, after this introduction, with the first issue, what is at stake here. The old story that has been told for many centuries was that pain and suffering are consequences of human disobedience or sin, original sin, and hence not something anterior or precedent that original wrongdoing. Today this position appears as naive and untenable, I am afraid. As theologian and expert on Christian anthropology, we know that due to biological conditions, pain and suffering were quite ubiquitous and common in the earth much before humans arrived at this scenario. We could retort that such suffering was less relevant as it affected mostly animals of pre-human hominids. But from an evolutionary look, the idea that such negative expressions may be considered as a disorder or something that is a consequence of deliberate sin makes today little sense. The account that the evolutionary studies offers is quite different. Pain and suffering belong to the evolutionary process as mechanisms that help to better drive the course of such evolution. They work as signals that show the right path towards more adaptive forms. Indeed, instead of being considered a byproduct of evolution or a disorder, these traits clearly show a positive function aimed at encouraging more fitting behaviors. However, other views inside the evolutionary field hold a rather minimalist opinion. In the words of my friend and colleague Jay Feierman, an expert on human ethology, hypothetically a naive evolutionary scholar could speculate that our subjective feelings of emotional pain and suffering, which rightly fall within the purview of the theodicy problem, evolved through evolution by natural selection. Such a speculation would be misplaced, according to Feierman. The only currency of natural selection is changes in the relative population frequencies of anatomical structural variations. A predisposition of two behaviors whose outcomes diminishes the subjective feeling of emotional pain and suffering, such as behaviorally getting oneself out of a bad situation, evolved by natural selection because in past the predisposed behaviors gave our ancestors a relative advantage in survival and reproductive success. But compared to a loving God, it is important to remember that natural selection is not an alternative to God, or it even provides little to the questions at stake on the theodicy question. Natural selection is blind to emotional pain and suffering. It is heartless. In contrast to emotional pain and suffering, physical pain receptors, or check engine light, are beneficial adaptations. They evolved by natural selection, as did the natural structures that generate the behavioral predispositions that, if possible, reduce physical pain. So there are still signals that could drive evolution and adaptiveness in a sense of in other. But there are a division among evolutionists who consider that probably we could take advantage of this process, selective process, and that perhaps it could help to better understand the goodness of all the evolutionary history. The perceived negative aspects associated to pain and suffering could be now seen as in a more positive light, according to this other reading of the story, and once more as a sign of divine wisdom and less as a scandal. This idea can be further reinforced by more recent studies that clearly showed how the capacity to suffer was linked to more evolved sentient animals and reveals features very useful for survival, adaptation, and sociality. It is well known that those people with impaired or reduced capacity to feel pain are less aware of damaging states in their bodies. I think we could extend this principle even to emotional pain, not just to physical pain. And usually they suffer a shorter life expectancy. The list of benefits linked to this capacity to suffer can be enlarged beyond the sheer physical level, as emotional and cognitive states associated with pain, loss, and other negative experiences become indicators assisting in better identifying what is wrong and to address things in a more accurate way. This is a sort of fine-tuning mechanism that allows humans and other animals to recognize what increases life quality or vitality and hence survival and reproductive ability. The former explanations could be seen as a good news from a theological perspective, which now can count on evolutionary studies as an ally, rendering the apparent nonsense of suffering something more bearable, understandable, and even positive. However, this impression is short-lived. The panorama that these studies offer render the dynamics of creation cruel and requesting a high price to pay as a condition for that model to work. The question now is whether God could conceive a different creation model and evolutionary path that could spare all that misery, the question that our former colleague was presenting. From a theological point of view, our image of God as wise and very good with its work becomes less convincing. The traditional schema was simpler and rendered a positive image of God that now is mostly lost. It just placed all that what is good, what is good in the divine side and what is wrong in the human side, assisted by the devil. The creation was conceived as harmonious and peaceful in the prelapsarian state. Humans did spoil all that good and beauty, and they are to blame for all this disaster. Now the created world as we know it requires a big amount of violence, destruction and suffering from the same moment of life eruption, not at a later stage. So that is the question that makes the traditional story, the storytelling, less credible in our times. Humans are now less to blame. After all, they are born into that sensitive world and suffered and benefited from that same model. They even raised the threshold and becoming much more sensitive than other animals, they could develop the capacities helping them to move further and the former stages characterized by lower sensitivity levels. For instance, some authors point to awareness or consciousness as a result of this capacity for suffering. Moral sense, compassion is an obvious feature too, or prosocial instincts. As a consequence of such development, negative traits turn out to render feasible very positive human features. This narrative just inverts the traditional one. It is not that we were nearly perfect creatures and through sin we lost many of our preternatural gifts. It is just the opposite. Through suffering, humans learn to be aware of their place and meaning in the world, their need to respect and help, and render them sensitive towards other suffering. Probably the evolutionary dynamics described by Tomasello and others leading towards joint attention and coordination would become impossible without intense levels of suffering, giving place to compassion and nourishing a sense of help and solidarity. Definitively, we would rather lose than gain in a world without suffering in terms of creativity, character formation, moral sensitivity, and caring capacity towards others, and even to develop virtue and divine revelation, points that are not new for theology, so that even revelation makes sense in a universe of pain and suffering, and without pain and suffering, divine revelation would make little sense. Theology is trying to adapt to this new scientific scenario. A traditional answer was that these negative episodes need to be seen as individual or exceptional circumstances, but the final outcome presents a well-functioning world, the thesis that Thomas Aquinas and other medieval thinkers were defending. The final gain will overflow the actual pain we still perceive. So not pain, no glory, or not pain, no gain. However, this explanation appears as less convincing when the amount of suffering we can still witness and bear hardly compensates and justifies the achievements in the final stages of evolutionary history. including those just described at the anthropological level. In truth, all the traditional Christian narration has changed under scientific pressure, and we need to adapt to the new representation of that evolutionary process signed by an unavoidable suffering, which can nevertheless be seen as a condition for a positive evolution. It is better to retake the argument later, if I have time. In my opinion, the problem and challenge for theology runs deeper. If evolutionary science manages to provide a satisfactory explanation about pain and suffering, whose positive effects could even exalt the human condition to some new heights, then theology could appear as redundant discourse. Why we need theology after all, when all things are well explained by natural science? Whatever it can say on this issue could be seen as irrelevant after applying the Occam razor or the principle of parsimony. If we have a convincing explanation of a phenomenon, we do not need to provide other reasons. This is the true challenge for theology, which could find out that its contribution to these issues appears now as outdated and rightly replaced by other forms of wisdom, providing better clues to understand and to tackle that thorny issue. Now it is up to theology, except that we assume theology as a pure internal discourse, trying to convince ourselves, so the practitioners inside the theological academy, about how to readapt the kind of divine action in this universe. But for those outside the theological academia, they will be absolutely irrelevant. So questions that have awake no interest. It's up to theology to offer some development or complementary text that allows to rediscover the reach and utility of its own view or approach, but such intervention will necessarily require assuming another reference point. Or in other words, we need to build on this new ground that science has rendered quite stable and open, not just based on old traditions. Indeed, as a recent book suggests, theology can qualify itself just in conjunction with scientific development, not aside or in concurrence with it. The book is, there are several authors, among them some colleagues of ours, recently published in 2023, Conjunctive Explanations in Science and Religion, Routledge. So, we move to the next question. What is still left to theology after scientific explanations? This is not a rhetorical question. Theology can continue to do business as usual and to deliver its own narrative about the dynamics between sin, suffering, death, and salvation. Or it can try a different path, exploring the recently opened horizons. Indeed, a consistent theological tradition that starts in St. Paul's letter to the Romans insists in the idea of sin and its consequences, suffering and death, as a condition that allows to perceive the salvific power of Christ through his death and resurrection. But we need to move more gradually if we intend to offer an updated theological argument. A starting point might resort to some observations or phenomenology around the experience of suffering, which can be linked more or less to physical and emotional pain. The first and obvious, raised many times in analysis about that issue, is that in more cases suffering does not seem to bear any benefit and ends in a fatal destiny, not in some lesson to be learned. Entire populations are wiped out in natural disasters or through human malevolent actions and wars, and we can hardly learn or get any positive input from all these disasters. Existential despair and a very pessimistic stance are the expected reactions for those who witness such disasters, and an inconceivable amount of misery and desolation. No justification could be provided by any scientific view of that. The worst is that this tendency could even bring humans to the edge of extinction by using available means of mass destruction. The dynamics of counter-adaptive behaviors and evolutions displayed in recent years by some evolutionist scholars like Boyd and Richardson still looms in human origin, despite the siren chants of those who bid for a positive evolution that would render all of us more peaceful and collaborative. So the thesis of Stephen Pinker and several others who bid for a evolution of human race that is increasing its altruistic capacities, and so we are getting all to be nicer and loving and caring and so on. The second observation concerns the previously suggested benefits linked to suffering. Several studies point out to links between that negative experience and empathy processes leading to compassion and prosocial behaviors, among other benefits which could be associated to the capacity to suffer. Probably that link makes sense. What is less accurate is to conceive a sort of automatic dynamic that links suffering to empathy and altruism. All of us can witness about persons who, perceiving other people's discomfort or even acute pain, do not react or feel moved towards assisting them. The same can be claimed regarding other features, like consciousness, moral sense, or creativity. They could arise after negative experiences, but they could become rather repressed or hindered by suffering, causing depressive states, despair, or deep anxiety, among most common symptoms we can register, and becoming the dark side of that experience. If you remember the time we were in lockdown during the pandemic, perhaps in few people it raised the creativity and so, but in most people they was triggering depression, anxiety, and so on. So, for my own observation and experience, it's not clear absolutely, or it's not discounted that through suffering we get positive outcomes. Naturalists could answer that suffering is a condition that might nourish positive reactions and advance the evolutionary clock, but this does not mean that always the mechanism works in the same positive way. Indeed, it works rather in an exceptional way. The amount of suffering we must bear, just in some cases, allows for evolutionary or adaptive progress. This is the same logic as in broadly conceived natural selection. Many variations get extinct, only few are selected and give place to fitter adaptations. But this is just how biology works, except that we humans, and not only, introduce another adaptive clue, and that is culture. And this changes sometimes radically the game's rules and conditions. Theology can find here new advantageous ground and some opportunities. The question now is, after recognizing the huge role culture plays in a process now designed as coevolution, to what extent Christian faith can render our approach to suffering more constructive or less destructive, and can correct trends that the biological dynamics could not correct or would need deep time, so hundreds of thousands of years to improve things. In the meanwhile, we would be left to a dark and miserable destiny, waiting for some progress that who knows when it will arrive. If we assume this new view in biological studies, possibly we can rescue and insert a more fitting role for religious faith and praxis as cultural dimensions that assist in the way we can deal with pain and suffering. The central point is that biology is not enough to deal with that reality, and that other forms of wisdom can contribute in an efficient way to address this huge challenge for us humans. To start with some example, the question arose in other forms in contemporary theology. For instance, Johann Baptist Metz proposed it in the 70s, when I was young and studying theology. It was for us a discovery, a theological model able to rescue from oblivion the millions of victims, often anonymous, in a history of progress and violence, or we would say an evolutionary history. Making sense of that immense crowd and providing hope for them was conceived as a theological and Christian function nobody else could provide. in a time when many intellectuals could design a future in which all religious functions could be assumed or replaced by secular means, and where social and moral progress could be entrusted to better policies based in better knowledge. Despite all the progress we could conceive, those left behind in that long and terrible history risk being neglected and drawn into the dark hole of evolutionary dynamics. This level needs to be vindicated as a minimal condition, helping to cope with meaningless suffering and loss, or to project meaning into what is apparently so meaningless. This is just a first level. We need to consider, for those who could be tempted to take theology as redundant or no longer useful in this new scientific context. Theology offers more resources to deal with suffering in a proper way, or a way that does not overlap with scientific approaches but complements them and provide a better understanding. The points I consider worthy to reflect are a better approach to suffering and love, the traditional idea of redemptive value of suffering, its moral treatment under the assistance of grace, and the healing effect of Christian grace. The aim is to propose a theology of pain and suffering that takes into account the scientific advances and so connects with them, and at the same time it tries to develop a program able to indicate the use and relevance of Christian approach. It becomes in this way less affected by the logic of redundancy and looks for some sort of conjunction between the theological and the scientific approach. Briefly, because I don't have time to explain all these points, but it's quite clear.
3 minutes.
Yes. Yes, excuse me the confusion with the slides. So the first point is that better approach to suffering and love, the Christian faith appears as a catalyzer that allows to complete the process from pain to care, so that it's not discounted. Even some philosophers and phenomenology were pleading for love being the result of a kind of spontaneous reaction before the other people suffering and the result of empathy mechanism, but it's absolutely not discounted. So I think that Christian faith and grace can provide a catalyzer that helps to speed up this reaction of responding with love and compassion to those who are suffering. The second one is the traditional idea of redemptive value of suffering. Redemption means an overcoming of sinfulness and vice through divine grace. I think this is a very theological idea and hard to translate into more scientific terms, but we need testimonies and we need rather a narrative of redemption and redemptive experiences, in the sense of suffering that is substitutive or that helps other people to overcome their suffering or their distress or their problems. Again, is a special performance that only inside the Christian framework can take place. Third is similar to the first, the moral treatment under the assistance of grace. Hardship can lead to resilience, but to desperation too. A religious catalyst is needed. That is the spontaneous story. Well, would be that through suffering and distress, we can build a better character and develop virtues. But again, that is not an automatic outcome. So without help of grace, it doesn't work. Or the last one, the healing effect of Christian grace. Christian faith and practices as means to cope and gain resilience after adversity and suffering. I will give a deeper look to this Well, this is a recent book on human fruition published by two colleagues, Reis and Blinks, in the field of dialogue science of religion, and how this is a topic that is being now quite fashionable, and to which surely religion in general and Christian faith in particular can contribute. But I want to draw your attention to this sort of new studies. This one I was involved in the reviewing process, and I was impressed because this is a team of Dutch colleagues, medicine doctors, theologians, and so on. And this is about a study of 83 healing reports. So people who report that to be healed from their illness after the intercession prayer or some people praying for them. And the interesting thing is that after examining the clinical reports, in 27 cases, the Commission arrived to the conclusion that there was no scientific explanation. They avoided the word miracles all through the article, but it was interesting that they outlined or highlighted this phenomena. We are not speaking about some remote place, about Holland, so that is a quite secularized society, and probably for this reason these kind of studies are quite interesting. I invited the main author, prof, to our next conference to be held in Assisi on this topic of religion, spirituality, and well-being, because he accepted. He will expose this research and new data about how Christian faith and prayer praxis can be a factor of healing. And well, this is not new. If you go to PubMed, open database of health sciences, and put in the browser window the words religion and health, you get 36,000 results, outcomes. And if you look at the plot, you can see that, yeah, the plot is here, that the great increase of this kind of studies correspond to the last few years. Another example in the same database, religious coping, they have 3,100 entries in the database. 3,000. So even for a PhD candidate, it would be difficult to manage all this amount of information about how religion in general and which kind of religions really assist in coping with distress, crisis, suffering and pain, and so on. Another example, yeah, there is the result of a project we were developing last year with Piotr and other colleagues, a study on 94 interviews we conducted, mostly here in Poland, on Ukrainian war refugees, mostly women who were involved in this study. And yeah, the interesting thing is that the results showed that the first coping and resilience strategy was social relationships and company, but the second one was prayer or interior life, and so on. Again, data that suggest about how Christian faith helps to cope. And back to the main issue, I read the conclusion, and so I spare you.
Time for discussion. So.
Yes. Well, in this case, yeah, the right question is to what extent Christian faith, prayer, and sacramental praxis contribute to an effective coping and healing before very negative and painful experiences. So the real question now is not to provide a good explanation that could compete with the biological explanations or with the other therapeutic explanation, praxis, and so on, but how Christian faith really helps to deal and to assist in these negative experiences. So a pragmatic approach about what works when dealing with pain and suffering is what should, in the last term, qualify a proposal and an approach to an issue at stake. And that brings me, or leads me to this conclusion that perhaps we need more a theology from below, an expression that was invented by the Germans, von unten, but was applied to Christology. But in my opinion, it should be extended towards other theological treatises, to Christian anthropology, to ecclesiology, to the Treaty of Credibility. So we should start from below, bottom up, to try to understand how Christian faith, and especially prayer and sacramental praxis, is helping people to overcome this negative experience, or is helping them to engage in solidarity, compassion, etc. And theology has to start with the salvific power of divine grace, to then go back to an analysis about what renders possible that healing. And so I was preparing a text on a new version to the chapter 5 of Roman, the letter to the Romans of St. Paul, but using a similar argument, so that all this suffering in the history, evolutionary history, points to the redemptive action of Christ. And now, through reverse engineering, through the experiences of healing and overcoming, through coping pain and suffering, we could really arrive to represent the contribution of Christian faith in a positive way that does not compete with other explanations, but just suggests that we have still a role to play. So, in conclusion, it would be a bad idea to close all the churches and send all the clergy, especially the Franciscan monks, to the Antarctica, as much farther better. So, because we have no role to play, we have nothing to provide, to contribute. So the point is that possibly through recovering all these positive functions that now are analyzed and researched through empirical studies and showing clear evidence about the positive effects of religious praxis, that through this way we can recover a territory, a theological territory, or a kind of possibility to interact with our scientific colleagues and to vindicate the role of Christian faith in these questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Father Luis.